On the frozen edge of the world, where the wind screams loud enough to crack iron, a man can watch his own warm breath freeze solid and shatter on the snow. It was late November, in the year 1886, along the rugged, windswept border of the Deck, Montana and Dakota territories, a vast expanse of land where the horizon seems to stretch on into infinity. Robert Campbell, a newly appointed government land surveyor and geologist, stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley, his hands wrapped tightly in heavy wool mittens as he adjusted his brass transit. Robert was a man deeply shaped by his East Coast education, possessing a firm belief in the absolute superiority of modern Western science, industrial progress, and rigid architectural principles. To him, the wilderness was a wild beast that was a wild beast that was a wild beast, needed to be tamed, measured, and built over with straight lines and heavy timber. What he did not yet realize, however, was that the northern plains were preparing to unleash a winter of such historic, catastrophic proportions that locals would speak of it in whispered, fearful tones for generations to come. The sky above had already taken on a flat, leaden gray color, heavy with the gray dactyon's promise of Arctic moisture, and the dry, freezing air carried a sharp, metallic bite. It was the warning sign of an impending Arctic wave, a massive wall of sub-zero air moving down from the Canadian Rockies that would soon lock the entire territory in an icy vice. Robert looked out over the valley, noting the gray clouds rolling over the distant bluffs, but felt no fear. He believed his scientific training and his newly built home would easily protect him. He was convinced that the raw power of industrialized design could conquer any storm the wild plains could throw at him. He packed his transit into its leather case, slung it over his shoulder, and began the long walk down the ridge, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen, stubbled grass. Across the valley, the first quiet flakes of snow began to drift lazily through the air, whispering of the bearing, frozen chaos that was about to descend upon the land. Robert's pride and joy sat on a small rise just above the creek bed, a newly bayed, finished 14 by 18-foot cabin built from heavy green pine logs. He had spent the late summer months supervising its construction, ensuring that every single log was milled to a perfectly flat surface and fitted with precise, square corners that conformed to the latest architectural manuals. Inside, he had built a heavy brick fireplace with a straight, wide chimney designed to draw smoke upward with maximum force, and he had installed a modern iron wood stove in the center of the main room. Robert believed this cabin was a monument to civilized progress, a rigid, heavy structure that stood in proud defiance of the wild, unorganized elements around it. To him, the heavy timber walls and the solid brick hearth represented safety, stability, and the triumph of human intellect over the chaotic forces of nature. To prepare for the winter, he had spent weeks cutting down pines and stacking a massive pile of wood near his blank front door, covering it with a heavy canvas tarp. However, the wood was green and damp, cut from living trees only weeks before, but Robert was unconcerned. He assumed the raw, concentrated heat of his modern iron stove would easily dry and burn the unseasoned timber. He walked around his cabin, tamping down the soil along the foundation, feeling a deep sense of security as he touched the flat, cold wood of the exterior walls. He believed that the thickness of the prosum, pine, and the solid weight of the brick would act as an impenetrable shield against the cold. He looked across the creek at Chayton's camp, shaking his head at what he saw as a stubborn refusal to adapt to the modern world. He was certain that his cabin, with its flat lines and heavy timber, would remain a cozy oasis of warmth, while the fragile leather tents across the water would quickly freeze to the ground. Directly across the frozen creek, in a sheltered grove of ancient cottonwood trees, Chayton, a Lakota elder, was methodically preparing his family's winter lodge. Chayton was a man who carried the accumulated wisdom of centuries in his memory, his face lined with the deep creases of a lifetime spent observing the power. Subtle patterns of the plains. He worked without haste, his movements deliberate and coordinated as he selected the long, slender poles of lodgepole pine that would form the skeleton of his home. He began by tying 3 primary poles together near their tops with a thick length of wet rawhide, raising them to form a sturdy tripod base that anchored firmly into the frozen ground. He then leaned 12 additional poles against this tripod, creating a strong, flexible, conical frame that was naturally balanced to distribute weight and tension. Over this wooden skeleton, Chayton and his wife, Istis, carefully stretched a heavy, seamless cover made from 15 brain-tanned, winter-cut buffalo hides, stitching the seams tightly with strong animal sinew. The hides were thick, possessing a natural density that had protected the great beasts from the very same blizzards they were now preparing to face. Chayton tensioned the cover, securing the bottom edge tightly to the earth with heavy wooden pegs, driven deep into the soil. Inside the lodge, his grandchildren, Kanji and Tala, worked quietly under their grandmother's direction, spreading dry willow brush and woven reed mats across the dirt floor to prepare the living space. The construction of the lodge was an organized, step-by-step process that required no iron nails, no milled lumber, and no complex tools. Yet every single element was positioned with absolute purpose. Chayton stood back, studying the taut, curved hide cover, knowing that his home was not a temporary tent, but a highly refined survival structure, designed to cooperate with the environment rather than fight it. As the late autumn days grew shorter and colder, the Lakota camp became a source of conversation among the settlers and travelers who frequented the nearby trading post. Many of the homesteaders, accustomed to the heavy, square sod, houses, and log cabins of the East, looked at Chayton's conical lodge with a mixture of amusement and genuine pity. They believed that a shelter made of nothing but wooden poles and animal skins was primitive, temporary, and entirely inadequate for a true plains winter. Robert Campbell was particularly vocal in his criticism, often sharing his architectural opinions with the other men at the post while they warmed their hands near the store's stove. He argued that Chayton's lodge lacked the basic structural requirements of a proper home, noting that the thin hide walls offered no thermal resistance and would easily bleed heat into the open air. He even walked across the creek one afternoon, standing near Chayton's lodge, as the elder was tamping down a layer of dry grass along the bottom rim of the hides. Robert pointed toward his own heavy cabin, attempting to explain through gestures and broken words that Chayton should build a proper timber house before the deep snows arrived. He warned Chayton that the coming winds would tear his hide cover to shreds, leaving his grandchildren to freeze in the open. Chayton listened to the surveyor with quiet, respectful attention, his dark eyes calm as he watched Robert's animated gestures. When Robert finished speaking, Chayton simply nodded once, patted the thick buffalo hide of his lodge, and went back to his work, his hands moving smoothly over the leather. Robert walked away, shaking his head at what he saw as a tragic, stubborn adherence to obsolete traditions. He was certain that when the first real blizzard struck, Chayton would be forced to abandon his fragile cone and seek shelter in the heavy, civilized cabin across the creek. The genius of Chayton's conical lodge lay in its shape, a form that was perfectly calculated to handle the relentless, crushing winds of the northern plains. While Robert's square cabin stood as a rigid obstacle in the wind's path, catching the full force of the gale along its flat vertical walls, the teepee was designed to let the wind slide past. A flat-walled building has a high drag coefficient, creating a massive high-pressure zone on the windward side that forces cold air through every tiny crack in the logs. The teepee, however, with its 55-degree conical slope, possessed a remarkably low drag coefficient of only 0.5, allowing the wind to flow around and over it with minimal resistance. This aerodynamic shape meant that even the strongest plains gale could not find a flat surface to batter against. Instead, the wind was deflected, wrapping around the curved hide cover and sliding harmlessly into the valley. This deflection of the wind had a profound effect on the interior environment of the lodge, as it prevented the formation of high-pressure drafts that normally plague rectangular structures. Furthermore, the conical shape was naturally self-stabilizing, as the wind pressure actually pushed the poles more firmly into the ground, locking the tripod base tighter with every gust. The steep, sloping sides of the teepee also performed a critical function when the Kaplee-heavy snows arrived, as the snow could not collect on a flat roof and create a dangerous structural load. Instead, the flakes slid down the curved leather walls, accumulating in a natural, protective ring around the base of the lodge that acted as a secondary windbreak. Chayton had positioned the long axis of the rate lodge with a slight tilt toward the east, a deliberate adjustment that made the back of the cone steeper to handle the brutal northwest winds. This asymmetric design ensured that the strongest forces of the storm were directed over the day's strongest part of the structure, letting physics do the work of survival. Inside the outer hide cover of the teepee sat Chayton's most powerful defense against the plains winter, the inner lining, often called the dew cloth. This lining was a separate, continuous band of hide that was suspended from the papilson's interior poles, reaching from the ground to a height of approximately 6 feet, completely encircling the living space. Chayton had secured the bottom edge of 22 ver, the lining tightly to the earth, packing it with dry grass and soil to create an airtight seal at the base of the floor. Between this inner lining and the outer hide cover sat a critical 4 to 6 inch air gap, a chamber of relatively still air that ran the entire circumference of the lodge. This air gap performed an extraordinary insulation function, acting as a convective barrier that prevented the freezing outside air from directly contacting the warm living space inside. The R value of this trapped air chamber, combined with the natural insulation of the thick buffalo hides, created a thermal barrier that surpassed the performance of many modern frame buildings. But the true genius of the day lining was how it managed the airflow inside the lodge, creating a coordinated, orderly convective loop that kept the interior warm and smoke-free. Cold outside, air was allowed to enter under the outer hide's bottom edge, but instead of blowing directly across the floor and freezing the family's feet, it was channeled upward into the air gap. As this air rose between the two hide layers, it was gradually warmed by the radiant heat of the central fire, slowly entering the main living room from above the lining. This warmed, fresh air then fed the central fire, creating a natural draft that pulled the smoke from the hearth straight up toward the apex opening. The entire lodge functioned like a highly efficient, passive climate control machine, ensuring a constant supply of fresh oxygen while keeping the living area warm and draft-free. To protect his family from the rising cold and the dampness of the plains, Chayton had constructed a multi-layered insulation system across the floor of the lodge. The ground on the northern plains in winter is a dangerous heat sink, a massive reservoir of frozen soil that can drain a human body's warmth through direct conduction within hours. To stop this conductive heat loss, Chayton's .10's grandchildren, under their grandmother's direction, had laid a thick base layer of dry willow brush and sagebrush across the dirt floor. This springy, porous wood created a small airspace between the frozen earth and the living area, preventing the cold from rising directly into the bedding. Over this wooden base, they laid tightly woven reed mats, which added another layer of dead air insulation, and over these mats, they spread 3 layers of thick, fur-on, winter bison robes. This heavy, layered floor stack-up provided an extraordinary thermal barrier, completely separating the family's sleeping bodies from the freezing ground beneath them. Above the sleeping area, Chayton had suspended the blanket actuary, ozone, an interior hide canopy that stretched horizontally across the back half of the lodge, creating a cozy, low-ceilinged chamber. This canopy performed a vital thermal function, as it trapped a pocket of rising warm air directly above the family's bedrolls, preventing it from escaping through the high smoke hole. The ozone also served as a secondary shield against the elements, catching any condensation drips that might form on the cold upper poles during a sudden thaw. Inside this protected, low-ceilinged sleeping space, the temperature remained remarkably stable, insulated from the ground below and protected from drafts by the inner lining. Chayton's grandchildren slept in the deepest, warmest part of this bedding, wrapped tightly in soft rabbit and wolf furs, safe from the cold. At the center of Chayton's lodge sat the fire pit, the hearth that served as the thermal engine for the entire structure. Unlike rectangular cabins, where fireplaces are built against a wall or in a corner, Chayton's hearth was positioned in the exact geometric center of the circular floor. This circular layout was highly efficient, as a circle has no corners where cold air can collect, stagnate, and resist the movement of heat. In a square room, the common/tom, corners act as dead zones, drawing warmth away from the center and creating massive temperature variations across the living space. In Chayton's lodge, however, the radiant infrared energy from the central fire traveled an equal distance to every single point on the circular wall, heating the space uniformly. The warmth rose naturally toward the apex of the cone, circulating gently along the curved hide walls in a coordinated, orderly flow that prevented hot air from pooling uselessly at the ceiling. To control this airflow, Chayton had engineered adjustable smoke flaps near the top opening of the lodge, controlled by two long external poles anchored to the ground. These flaps could be opened, closed, or angled, depending on the direction of the wind, acting as a desio, a natural chimney damper that managed the draft of the fire. By angling the flaps away from the wind, Chayton created a localized low-pressure zone directly over the smoke hole, which sucked the fire smoke upward while keeping the warm air inside. At night, Chayton would reduce the fire to a bed of glowing coals, covering them lightly with ash to preserve the heat until morning without wasting valuable wood. This structured, methodical fuel management ensured that the lodge remained warm throughout the freezing plains, nights on only a fraction of the wood his neighbors consumed. The Arctic waves struck the valley on the afternoon of January 11th with a prescient, sudden, terrifying violence that caught the territory in its icy grip. The wind, which had been a low murmur all morning, suddenly roared down from the northwest with the force of a locomotive, carrying a wall of blinding horizontal snow. The temperature plummeted with shocking speed, dropping from a relatively mild 10 degrees to a brutal 32 below zero in less than 3 hours. By nightfall, the thermometer outside Robert Campbell's cabin read 42 below, and the wind chill reached a deadly 75 degrees below zero. It was a cold of such intense, crushing power that the heavy timber of the surrounding pines groaned and cracked in the dark, their moisture freezing and expanding inside the wood. On the open plains, the blizzard turned the world into a white, suffocating void, where a man could not see his face, before his face, and the black, wind-stripped heat from any exposed surface instantly. Robert stood in his cabin, listening to the relentless rattle of the wind against his heavy pine logs, feeling the first real tremors of unease in his chest. The wind, broadsiding his square walls with maximum velocity, created a massive, high-pressure zone that began to force freezing air through every tiny crack and claskring, his log chinking. He could feel the cold drafts creeping across his pine floor, pooling around his ankles like water, while the warmth from his fireplace rose uselessly to the high ceiling. The heavy timber walls, which he had trusted to act as an impenetrable shield, had gone cold, the flat wood surfaces drawing heat out of the interior air and radiating a deep bone-chilling cold back into the room. Robert built up his fire, throwing several heavy logs onto the hearth, but the cold draft across the floor was relentless, and frost began to form on the inside of his windows. As the storm entered its second day, the structural limitations of Robert's cabin began to show with disastrous, life-threatening clarity. The green, unseasoned pine logs he had stacked under his canvas tarp had frozen into a solid, icy mass, making them nearly impossible to split or light. When he finally managed to force a damp log into his iron stove, the wood would not burn. Instead, it smoldered miserably, producing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the small room. The howling northwest wind, slamming directly against his straight chimney, created a powerful backdraft that forced the smoke back down, the flue choking his family. Robert was forced to crack open a south-facing window just an inch to allow the smoke to escape, but this small opening let in a rush of sub-zero air that dropped the interior temperature instantly. The cold drafts across his floorboards grew stronger, snuffing out a candle he had placed on the table, and the interior walls of the cabin began to grow slick with ice. The moisture from his family's breath, unable to escape through the sealed, rigid logs, had condensed on the cold wood surfaces, freezing into a thick layer of frost that coated the room. Robert's wife, Eleanor, sat near the stove, wrapping their two young children in every blanket they owned, her hands shaking as she tried to keep them warm. The temperature near the floor had dropped to 28 degrees, and Robert could hear his youngest daughter, Mary, beginning to cough, a wet, rattling sound that filled him with dread. He realized with a sinking heart that his heavy, civilized cabin had failed him. The flat lines, the square corners, and the unseasoned timber had turned his home into an unheated icebox. By the morning of January 13th, the situation inside the cabin had become desperate, and Robert knew his family would not survive another night. The iron stove was cold, his green wood supply was exhausted, and the ice on his interior walls had grown to a quarter-inch thick, glinting dully in the dim light. Robert looked at his shivering children, their faces pale, and their lips tinged with blue, and made the hardest decision of his life. They had to leave. He wrapped his family in their heaviest coats and wool blankets, tied a long length of hemp rope around his waist, and secured the other end to Eleanor and the children. He pushed open the heavy cabin door, which was blocked by a 3-foot drift of snow, and stepped out into the blinding, white chaos of the plains blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, freezing the moisture in his nose instantly, and making his lungs ache with every breath. He could not see the creek bed, let alone Chayton's camp, but he guided his family forward by memory, struggling through the waist-deep, wind-packed drifts. The wind was relentless, a constant, deafening roar that threatened to knock them off their feet with every step, and the blowing snow stung his eyes like sand. Robert crawled on his hands and knees, dragging his children through the drifts, his fingers losing all feeling despite his heavy mittens. He felt a deep, overwhelming sense of failure. His scientific training, his modern technology, and his civilized pride had led his family to the brink of death. Just as his strength was about to fail, his hand touched the taut, frozen leather of Chayton's outer hide cover, and he let out a choked cry of relief. Robert fumbled in the blinding snow, finding the narrow entrance of the lodge, and pushed his shivering family through the hide flap into the darkness. The moment he stepped inside, the howling chaos of the plains vanished, replaced by to-the-block sprock, an extraordinary, draft-free stillness that took his breath away. The air inside the lodge was clean, dry, and warm, carrying the gentle scent of sage and burning cottonwood coals. And a modest fire glowed brightly in the central hearth, Chayton stood up from his bison robes, his face calm and unhurried as he welcomed the freezing family, his wife immediately taking the children and wrapping them in soft furs. Robert stood in the center of the lodge, his body shaking with cold, but he could feel the radiant warmth from the stone-lined hearth and the circular hide walls washing over his skin. He pulled his brass transit thermometer from his coat pocket, a habit of measurement he could not shake even in his state of shock, and watched the mercury column rise. Outside, the temperature was 42 below zero, with a deadly wind chill. Inside Chayton's fragile leather tent, the thermometer read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Robert stared at the mercury, unable to believe his eyes. A temperature difference of over 100 degrees, maintained in a structure made of nothing but poles and hides. He looked at Chayton's fire, noting that it was small, no larger than a dinner plate, yet the interior held the warmth with an efficiency he had never seen in any brick fireplace. There was no smoke, no drafts, and no frost on the interior walls. The convective loop of the lining was working perfectly, pulling fresh air in and exhausting the smoke upward. Robert looked at his children, who were already warming their hands near the Prite.com fire, their color returning, and he felt a profound, humbling realization wash over him. As the storm continued to rage outside, Robert sat quietly on a thick pile of bison robes, cradling a warm bowl of broth that Istis had handed him. The radiant heat from the central fire seemed to penetrate deep into his bones, thawing the physical cold that had gripped his body. But the shift happening inside his mind was far more profound. He looked around the circular room, studying the taut, curved hides of the lining, the elegant geometry of the sevenet, poles, and the quiet, orderly behavior of Chayton's family. He realized with absolute clarity that his formal engineering education, his straight lines, and his civilized pride had been nothing but arrogance in the face of a reality he did not understand. He had believed that the wilderness was an enemy to be conquered with raw, heavy power, but Chayton's home proved that survival was about cooperation, observation, and respect for natural laws. The Lakota Lodge was not a primitive tent, but a highly sophisticated piece of thermal engineering refined over centuries of trial and error to work in perfect harmony with the plains. Chayton had not fought the wind. He had designed a shape that deflected it. He had not fought the cold ground. He had built a layered barrier that stopped it. Robert felt a deep sense of humility, gratitude, as he watched Chayton tend the glowing embers, his movements calm, full of a quiet dignity that needed no validation. He realized that the true genius of the Plains tribes lay not in complex machines, but in a deep, intimate understanding of the physical world. He looked at his own family, who were sleeping soundly under the soft furs of the bedrolls, their breathing regular and safe, and he knew that he owed their lives to the very man he had dismissed as a fool. When the blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 22nd, the sun rose on a valley that had been completely transformed by the snow, but Robert was already a different man. He returned to his frozen cabin, not to rebuild the frozen cabin, cold, rigid logs, but to document the precise dimensions and airflow patterns of Chayton's lodge using his surveyor's tools. He spent days sketching the angles of the poles, measuring the air gap between the outer hide and the inner lining, and calculating the heat distribution of the central hearth. He then visited the neighboring settlers who had barely survived the storm, some of whom had lost livestock, fuel, and their own fingers to the frost. Robert did not boast, lecture. Instead, he showed them his drawings and his measurements, explaining, with quiet, respectful passion, how the Lakota design had saved his family's lives. Under his guidance, the homesteaders began to adapt Chayton's principles to their own square cabins, constructing inner liners of canvas and wool create insulating air gaps along their drafty log walls. They modified their fireplaces to draw air from the floor level and distribute radiant heat more evenly, and they built layered cedar branch insulation barriers beneath their wooden floors. Within weeks, the fuel consumption across the settlement dropped by nearly half, and the cabins became warmer, drier, and safer than they had ever been. Robert's scientific documentation of the teepee's physics became a clachan, bridge of understanding between two worlds, proving that traditional knowledge and modern science did not have to be enemies, but could work together to protect human life. The bond that was forged between Robert and Chayton during those freezing January nights outlasted the winter of 1886 and reshaped the future of the Big Valley. Robert used his position as a government land surveyor to protect Chayton's family and their grove of cottonwoods, ensuring that their land was respected and honored by the arriving settlers. He became a strong, vocal advocate for the Lakota people, sharing the story of their hospitality, intelligence, and their engineering mastery with officials in Helena and Washington. Chayton's camp became a place of connection and learning, where settlers and native people gathered to share knowledge, trade goods, and build friendships based on mutual respect. The visual of Robert's children playing with Chayton's grandchildren in the warm, dry teepee became a common sight in the Plosivin Valley, a symbol of hope and cooperation in a land that had once been defined by conflict. Robert never forgot the lesson he had learned in the storm. That true progress requires humility, the willingness to listen, and the courage to admit when our own assumptions have failed us. He continued to study the traditional building methods of the Plains tribes, incorporating their principles of airflow and thermal mass into every structure he designed in his later career. The round, stone cabins, the double-walled barns, and the insulated shelters that began to appear across the territory were all inspired by the quiet wisdom of Chayton's lodge. The old Lakota elder had not sought recognition or praise. He had simply kept his family warm, and in doing so, he had taught a proud young surveyor how to truly live in harmony with the wild plains. The teepee remains one of the most brilliant and enduring examples of human ingenuity in the history of North America. Its circular shape, its double-walled convective air gap, and its adjustable smoke flaps represent a level of thermal mastery that modern building science continues to study and replicate. From high-altitude mountaineering tents to advanced off-grid insulation systems, the principles of the Plains Winter Lodge still protect lives in the coldest places on Earth. If this journey into the hidden intelligence of the past has changed how you think about traditional survival, we invite you to like this video and subscribe our channel for more stories of human resilience. We read every single comment, and we want to know, what ancient technique from your own region do you think modern science has forgotten? Sometimes, the most advanced solutions are not those we build for the future, but those we remember from our past. By looking back with humility, we can find the wisdom to build a warmer, safer, and more connected world. Thank you for watching, and stay warm out there.